Good morning. Welcome to Montview Church located in Park Hill, Denver, Colorado. My name is Malcolm, as most of you know. And today, the Adult Faith Formation will present the second session on mental health and wellness. Our presenter today is the Reverend Dr. Marjorie Barbara Lewis. Dr. Lewis holds three master's degrees and 3 doctorate degrees, a PhD in public analysis, public policy and analysis, and a doctor of ministry, and several honorary doctorate degrees as well. She's earned various academic credentials in public policy analysis, pastoral care, counseling, business and public administration. She hails from the DMV by way of Shaw University, University of Maryland, Norfolk University, Howard University, Southeastern University, Carnegie Mellon University, University of California, Berkeley, University of Colorado, and the University of Minnesota. And she combines academic and applied orientation as a researcher, scholar, public author, and an educator trainer. Her tenure in Denver, Colorado features previous service through Metropolitan Academy of Behavioral Health as a behavior economist, public policy analyst. University of Colorado, Denver Graduate School of Public Affairs, formerly a tenured track professor and a founding tenured faculty person of the American Pathways University. She has served as a member of the Colorado Board of Parole and the Colorado Justice Institute. She is currently serving as the Well Power, former name, Mental Health Center of Denver, Board of Directors, the Greater Metro Denver Ministerial Alliance, and the resident scholar of the Colorado Black Roundtable. Her recent and most important title of the Colorado is a matriarch of the paternal family system as of January the 7th, 2024. Her most effective quote when leading family members, students, and others is that, "You may be great, but not that great yet." I have known Marjorie for over 30 years. Upon my arrival here in 1994 in Denver, Colorado, she was then and still is a stakeholder in the Black community here in Denver, Colorado. She and I together have helped to establish 2 colleges, the Denver Institute of Urban Studies, founding board members of the American Pathways University. So we've been knowing each other for a long time. And so I think we are privileged to have her today. And her basic topic, by the way, her PowerPoint is not working this morning, but she's very confident that she can do it without it. Her presentation will include the following: mental health and wellness defined, the adverse impact of trauma on a person's life, contrasting mental health, mental illness, and personality disorder, treating reversible and irreversible conditions, and how to facilitate change in behaviors. Last but not least, the importance of spirituality in treating mental disorder. Please help me to welcome Dr. Marjorie Lewis to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm wearing this because the kids gave me 3 of these for Christmas. And while they're in the DMV, and by the way, DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia, Denver, Colorado is the new DC, just for your information. We're the DC now. So they're streaming, so I thought I'd let them know I do wear the clothes you give me. So for the kids, here you are, kids. Here it is. I want to thank you all for your kindness and for your attendance. And as we sort of move through this month emphasizing mental health and wellness. Mental health and wellness. If you are inclined to want to see the PowerPoint, I'm happy to make it available. I have two wonderful snippets that I think would enhance. And one is of one of my colleagues sharing about intergenerational trauma. And I told Malcolm, well, she doesn't get to take all of the stage. I'll just have to do it. So maybe this is a blessing in disguise, but I promise if you're interested in the PowerPoint, more than happy to make it available. I had, and we'll start out by just, first of all, contrasting mental illness and, thank you. Malcolm always tries to tell me what to say. Yeah, 30 years of this, you know. So, first I want to contrast mental illness and mental health and wellness and behavioral health. They're very different. And often we don't sort of look at the differences. And for that reason, it invokes a lot of stigma around the issue, you see. When we think about mental illness, which is usually the most prominent title that we give to maladaptive behavior, mental illness, crazy, whatever you want to call it. You know, mental illness technically is a condition that cannot be reversed. I don't care how many brilliant people one talks to, professional, lay, it doesn't matter. It cannot be reversed. That's why you have psychiatrists managing it. And that's what they do. They manage it. Diagnoses like schizophrenia, bipolar syndrome. I hate the word disorder. It's amazing. You want to talk about microaggressions. People in my field use more microaggressive behavior with their clients than anybody I know. And it's not about race, class, or gender either. It's about misappropriating stigma with mental health and wellness. But when we talk about mental illness, you need a medical person to write out prescriptions to manage it, you see. And then they're combining it with behavior modification does help. And think about the movie A Beautiful Mind. I'm sure you all saw Russell Crowe. I thought he was at his best when he played the role of John Nash, who had a mental illness. It was schizophrenia. He took medication. He also talked to behavioralists to know how to behave with the irreversible condition. Not that you all had time to look at the details, but as the movie sort of ends, you see the figures that only he could see. Remember, it was a little girl, his old roommate, and that FBI agent. Woo, he was scary. They never went away. He always saw them, but he learned not to pay attention to them. That's what mental illness is about. Then you have this thing called behavioral issues. And I tell my students the difference is you can reverse a behavioral issue. Substance abuse is seen as a behavioral issue. It is not a mental illness. Trauma is a behavioral issue. It is not a mental illness. Trauma or the impact of trauma itself can be reversed. Some of my colleagues and I discuss it, but we have concluded if an event happens and I find it to be overwhelming, leaving me perceiving myself as helpless and hopeless with no option, yes, that is a trauma. But with work, I can transform that trauma, you see. The reason why there is such discussion about it being a mental illness is found in the fact that people will say, I can't forget the event. You weren't supposed to forget the event. You were supposed to be delivered from the emotional pain. Aaron Beck, Cognitive Behavior Therapy, the emotional pain around the event. The event came to teach you, you see. The problem is the job wasn't complete because the event caused such trauma that we can't get over our acute response to it, you see. And so when we think about trauma, know this. Trauma is in the eye of the beholder. It's in the eye of the beholder. What one of you all might see as trauma, I might not see as trauma. I had a client, oh God, I hope she's not looking, but I'm gonna talk about her. She got traumatized because she broke her fingernail. I mean, really traumatized. You look at mine, it's like, what? A fingernail? Are you serious? But you see, it's not my place to judge what traumatizes her. Some of my intern students and even relatives pay so much for their fingernails, I guess I'd be traumatized if I broke one too. So I get it. But the point is, when we think about trauma and people who are struggling with it, just remember, trauma is found in the eye of the beholder. And you and I have no right to judge the validity of anybody's perception of trauma. So as we move through, I had a nice video that talked about the definition, but it's easy enough. An event that will occur that interrupts our homeostasis. You know, we're steady state, moving along, everything's good, and then something comes along and interrupts it. And maybe I can give you an example. Would you like an example? Okay, you ready? Ready? Ah! There it was. You stopped for a minute. Assessed very quickly and decided there's no danger. There's no danger. But there was a trauma there. It will never devolve into PTSD, I don't think. I hope I didn't trigger anybody with the sound. But know that it is trauma. It's acute trauma, acute stress. And because it interrupted the flow, a calm voice, and all of a sudden it's bang, that caused us to, and I saw you just stopped. And in that short period of time, you assessed, and you decided, oh, it's cool. Oh, that's her point. I get it. And you won't give it a second thought unless you're joking about it with a friend. That's it. You won't have any nightmares, any cold sweats. You won't do avoidance in relation to large sounds. You won't avoid me, I hope. You know, none of that. Because it didn't cause anything that is post-acute. It's just acute. Everybody experiences trauma. It's a sense of the interruption, and then the depth of it is a function of how we perceive it. Have you ever noticed that some people, when even just looking at a TV show, they get all flustered? Or hearing a story of somebody's hard time, they get flustered, or seeing a car accident or the result of one, just a car turned over, and they get flustered. It's because they've internalized the situation. And then there are those of us who see it and we leave it over there, and that allows us to be able to walk over and help with the situation. Same event, different perspective. Same event, different perspective. And that's another dimension of trauma, when we internalize things that are going on, as opposed to sort of keeping them external in order to remain objective and able to help people with their journey, you see. Their journey is not necessarily our journey, and when we remember that, we're better able to respond without being a distraction. When we talk about trauma, there's a difference between, let me take this. Okay, yeah. There's a difference between acute stress, post-traumatic stress. There's a difference between good stress and bad stress. We often correlate trauma with stress, but all stress isn't bad. Stress got you up this morning, and as Presbyterians, got us to church on time. Yeah. I remember when I first, started affiliating with the church, it'd be like, I told my girlfriend, I said, I got to get to this church on time. They don't play that. They don't play that 5-10 minute late stuff. You got to, doing this, you can't do that. You just got to walk in. But stress got you up this morning. Stress got you dressed. Stress got you in your car. Stress got you here on time. We call that eustress, EUSTRESS, and it's in the PowerPoint. And then, perfect peace is where I have no stress. When I have no stress, I'm good for nothing but sleeping. That's it. Oh, there's a serial killer on your block. It's like, whatever, I'm going to bed. God, you got that. I'm about to be stress-free, which means what? I'm basically good for nothing but sleeping. I don't care if the plane is leaving at 7 a.m., I'm stress-free, which means what? I missed my flight. Perfect peace is dysfunctional when it comes to living our everyday lives, but it certainly does help when it's time to go to bed. That's what it's good for. And then you have different levels of stress. You have the green zone. That's where I have enough stress to love family and friends, play with my, kids, great nieces, great nephews. I am the matriarch of my maternal family system as of January 7th. It's a status that you pay dearly for, but I'm going to use it. I'm going to have some fun with it. I talked to my first cousin who left on that date. I said, okay, it's my turn. Tell me what to do. She said, just love them as best you can, But the bottom line is, in relation to understanding this concept of the green zone, I get to talk to them, play with them. I have enough energy to be annoyed with the little ones, like, where's your mother? Where is she? Oh, my God. Where's your father? Oh, my God. But that's stress, but it's good stress. It's the kind of stress that has you and I responding to our environment, the green zone, the eustress. That kind of stress also, as it sort of reaches its optimal point, is the kind of stress that allows us to do good work when we go to work, our 9 to 5, or when we do our volunteer work, you see. There's a certain amount of stress. It's functional stress. But imagine working in a situation where the more work you do, the more work you get. The more work you do, the more work you get. After a while, that eustress starts sort of moving to a point of distress. You get a little irritated. You get a little resentful, a little fear, etc. And just imagine more and more work put upon you, and you perceiving that you can't handle it. It becomes more and more toxic, to the point that in my field we call it vicarious stress, compassion fatigue. I'm sure you all have heard that in your circles. This is where the amount of responsibility or perception devolves to the point that we become very resentful, very angry, and if it doesn't stop, we burn out, shut down, explode, implode, you see. So all stress isn't bad. It's just the distress piece. Stress is good until it's not, you see. So as we sort of look at trauma, trauma occurs on the distress side, you see. And in relation to trauma, it is a function of how we see the situation, how we see the world, and the impact of it is a function of how resilient we are, Things like early intervention when we experience distress. It could be as simple as me giving you a phone call just to talk it through, and you being compassionate enough to hear me and just let me get it off my chest. That is one way to mitigate the implications of distress, you see. Nip it in the bud, catch it early. And that way, it doesn't devolve to something that is often misconstrued as a mental illness. It's not a mental illness, it's just distress that was not appropriately resolved. Some of us can have learned to resolve distress easily. Get a dog or a cat. I don't have any of those, but a lot of people do, and they work. Aromatherapy, music therapy, movie therapy, walking in the woods, those are ways to what? Mitigate trauma, to resolve stress before it gets too big to handle. A couple of years ago, maybe 3 now, for my birthday, the family sent me on an excursion. I went waterfall hunting. Can you believe it? Looking for waterfalls. I think I found like 11 down in the southeast part of the country. And what came to my mind was, with trauma, you don't want to wait till it becomes a full-fledged waterfall. You want to nip it in the bud while it is a calm, sort of placid lake, you see, before it goes over the edge. And when we talk about distress, we're going to suffer it. The key is to nip it in the bud by seeing it from a different perspective, such that we realize the event occurred for our good. Granger Westberg wrote a book entitled Good Grief, and I love what he said. Grieving is not complete until you can celebrate the loss. And that applies in relation to resolving the issue of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. When we think about trauma, we realize that if we make it through, and we would have made it through, otherwise it wouldn't be trauma, we wouldn't be around to be affected by it. As we make it through, looking back on it, we don't need to dwell on, I could have died, dwell on, but I didn't. There's a song that I listen to a lot. It's called, I've been through the fire, but I got out. You see, and that is the way to think about it. Not think about the details of the fire. You got out. Celebrate that. That's how you mitigate a lot of the dysfunctionality associated with trauma. I see the situation. I'm helpless, or I think I am, helpless, hopeless. I want to run away, but there's nowhere to run. I want to fight, but I can't win. Those are 2 of the most commonly known reactions, so I'll just freeze. I'll just dissociate from the situation. fight, flight, or freeze. And if indeed I don't get resolution from the perceived vulnerability relative to the event, then the way that you all reacted when I hollered for the experiment, that will be how one would react every time one thinks about the noise, you see. And that is basically the implications of trauma. I act as if the event just happened every time I think about it, you see. And there is the rub and the dysfunction. So as we sort of think about trauma, and we're talking among friends, lay people, that you can think about it that way, unresolved distress. So as I sort of reflect on trauma is found in the eye of the beholder, of course, in this church, we're very sensitive to the cultural dynamics associated with human utility. So, trauma in one culture might be very different from trauma in another culture. Carl Rogers, I think in his client-centered therapeutic theorizing, pointed out the importance of recognizing utility relative to individuals. Well, it applies to culture, because technically culture is client-centered therapy on steroids. The sum total of your life experience is your culture. Twins could have two distinctively different cultures, informed by any number of experiences. Perhaps one twin was held more by mama and the other one was held more by daddy. You do understand that impacts their personal culture. I had a set of twins as clients when I was really engrossed in direct services. African American girls, 17, got in trouble, so they sent them to me. It's like, I want to say, just sit down and shut up and listen, but I had to be nice. And I let them cathart, and I realized, they weren't identical. One was very light, and the other was very dark. Very different stories, even though they were twins. You see, one experienced one thing based on a variety of variables relative to her human experience, and the other experienced very different things. They had different trauma stories also. But my point is, in relation to culture, when we look at it from a microsystemic, individual perspective, it's just the sum total of one's life experience, informed by race, informed by gender, informed by socioeconomic status. And when I say gender, I'm including other orientations also. You see, that informs my culture, but that's not my culture. I'm a black woman, but black doesn't define my culture. There are so many other variables that come into it. And my life experiences will determine my trauma, you see. We all have a trauma story based on our culture, our personal culture. So as we sort of remember that, hopefully the term trauma is found in the eye of the beholder becomes more relevant. Why would we include personality disorders in this discussion? This lady named Marsha Lanahan, I love her. She's Washington, Seattle, Washington. I was actually trained by her for DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. And she, along with another star, Francine Shapiro, with the eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing, allow us to understand personality syndromes. I hate the word disorder, but it's still in the DSM-5, so I can't, yeah. But when the DSM-6 comes out, all of our work will be manifested. Get rid of those terms. Disorder, excuse me. You know, we didn't call them disorders 100 years ago. Bipolar. Oh, she moody. You know, we didn't have all of these terms. And we have to be sensitive to that. But the personality disorder syndromes, whether they are within 3 different clusters, cluster A, some people identify it as that cluster being sort of like people who see things a little more erratically, a little differently. Forgive the word, but it's just to help you remember. Cluster A is often seen as mad, because what? They're so different. Schizophrenia, you say they're mad. Maybe you're just, or I'm just inadequate. They might be seeing things that we just can't see. Why do they have to be wrong? Because they can see things that we can't see, you see. Just an example, and to make it okay to use that word. And then you have cluster B, and that's the popular cluster. We call that bad. Histrionic disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, things like that, bad, Histrionic, always want attention, all of that. Antisocial, I heard a judge say the only thing we can do for people suffering from that is to put them in jail. Not to degrade the judge, but he was just speaking from experience, because hard to deal with them. And then we have the SAD, cluster C. And this is where you have the dependent disorders and other issues associated with that piece. Not that you're here for a lesson in that, but Marsha Lanahan and Francine Shapiro point out that when you take a deep dive into the disorders as a function of syndrome, you realize that, especially with cluster B, they see the correlation between unresolved trauma and the personality disorder syndrome. And I have been known to say, if I could just get to certain people who are very important in our political sphere and just have 2 or 3 sessions with them and just figure out what the trauma was, we probably could, handle things a little differently. And when I see it that way, it also invokes a certain amount of compassion. Because this thing called adverse childhood experiences, which serve as the major source of trauma, things that happened to you when you were a child. 10 items on that survey. When you look at that, abusive parents represent one of the factors there. And the trauma, unresolved trauma that comes with it, could explain borderline personality disorder syndrome, antisocial personality syndrome, histrionic, the drama king or queen, etc., and narcissistic personality disorder syndrome. So just understanding that trauma is where our lives are interrupted in ways that we perceive hurting us and are not being able to do anything about it. And when does that usually happen? When we're children. We're not in charge. We're subject to people. And grandparents and parents are very different with kids. Parents is like, get up, let's go, gotta go to work, get your clothes on, come on. Grandparents, come on, let's go, etc. And studies have shown that kids who grow up with grandparents have higher levels of self-efficacy because the potential for parental trauma is reduced because what? Grandma, grandpa, auntie, and them step in. One of my great nephews called once and he said, Auntie, save me. Dad's gone crazy. I said, put him on the phone. And, it just helps to have that resiliency factor. Grandparents, a good source of resilience. Didn't mean to get off topic, but I'm still excited about this matriarchal status that I have now. So as we think about, the personality disorders or the syndrome associated with it, and what's a syndrome? We don't know all of what's going on over there, so we're going to identify it as a syndrome until we can better diagnose it. And when we think about Lanahan and Shapiro, we realize that a lot of the quirky behavior is a function of unresolved trauma. Unresolved trauma. Erik Erikson knew it. Anybody know the stages of human development? I love that. I'm writing a book on stage 8. That's that last stage. Pat, yeah, that's Pat over there. Somebody in our group said, well, what happens in stage 9? It's like, you're not worried about stage 9. Stage 8 is it for us here. At stage 9, it's like, whatever. It's cool. As the old folks will say, you looking down from heaven, just checking things out, laughing like crazy. It's like, yeah, okay. But stage 8, it allows us to move through our better years. Because Scripture says what? Your latter years will be better than your former years. And I kept thinking, so how do I make that happen? Point is, in relation to the stages, Erikson points out what happens when any of those stages are traumatized. Something comes to interrupt the work, you see. Just trying to help understand trauma and the personality disorder syndrome associated with unresolved trauma and remembering that trauma is the gateway emotion to a whole lot of things. People with unresolved trauma, 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. People with unresolved trauma, 6 to 8 times more likely to engage and indulge in at-risk substance usage, and so many other dysfunctions in relation to my personal utility. See, at-risk substance use is at risk when, if it's me, when I decide it's at risk, not when the society decides it's at risk, you see. And it's not just substance use, food, shopping, all of that is at risk. So when we think about trauma and personality disorder syndrome, we want to remember that the personality disorder syndromes are reversible, and that's why they were bumped up to a status in relation to an Axis 1 status in the DSM-5, because we saw them as reversible now. Handle the trauma. Handle the perception relative to the person enduring the trauma. Assure them and let them know that it can be resolved. And if it can't be, if the condition cannot be resolved, we have qualified people to what? Manage it, you see. So as we sort of just understand trauma, childhood, post-traumatic stress disorder, unresolved at the time. When we understand that, we have to just realize that it can be resolved, and as a church, we can play a major role in doing that simply by developing listening skills and also knowing where to send our people when they are in distress. You see, you don't have to resolve the distress, but you have to be open enough to hear it and recognize that their distress is not yours and it's not mine, and allow them to be entitled to their distress. Trauma that is not transformed is transferred, and that is what happens with intergenerational trauma. When we haven't used it to grow, and it's still crippling us because we haven't resolved it. And then we pass it on from generation to generation to generation. Another presentation at another time, and I hope that we'll have a chance to talk again. Thank you.
I was curious about your use of the matriarchy thing, and you defined it as exactly a period and a day. When you, and I might have misunderstood, but it says, what on earth happened to that day that the matriarchy was established?
My first cousin, who was 2 years older than I am, passed. And she was the oldest living person in the maternal family system, which made her the matriarch. And when she left, it was my turn to step up. I remember when my aunt died, my Aunt Florine, that was on my father's side, but just I'm not the matriarch there yet. I hope I never have to become that. But when my aunt died, the next generation, myself, my brothers, and my first cousins, the kids said, okay, you all's turn. It's like, gee, thanks. But you see, it's kind of like the oldest member of the family. If it were a male, he would be the patriarch, you see. But that's it. Mardell Wade Ruffin passed on January 7th, 2024. And that's when I became the matriarch. And they buy you clothes. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. I mean, forgive me, I'm a clothes hound, but, it's a lot of fun. But it's a painful initiation process. Very painful.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I was hoping you might touch on the collective trauma of the COVID times.
Okay.
Seems like everyone I know has some sort of issue now. My family, my friends.
COVID compromised our resiliency factors, you see. Some of my colleagues pointed out, we go to church. We go to church to what? Release. I'm actually writing a paper on the power of the church, particularly the black church, not exclusively, but just looking at how early on, maybe 50 years, 100 years ago, you talk about group level intervention to cathart acute anxiety. You go to church on Sunday morning and just let it out. Enough to what? Endure for the week, and then you come back. If you needed a pick-me-up, you come on Wednesday night for Bible study. And you see, that was taken away. Engaging with people directly, which helps assuage anxiety, because just communicating with people in a positive way increases the release of this neurotransmitter called endorphins. Makes you feel good. That was what? Taken away. Zoom, Microsoft Teams, it kind of does it, but it's nothing like being around people. And then the human touch was taken away. School, can't interact, taken away, you see. So it compromised a lot of our resiliency factors. That's why it's so universal. The trauma is different because we had different ways of coping, but that's what happened with COVID. It took away many of our resiliency factors. And it really impacted everybody because we all have them and we all took them for granted and they were all taken away, whatever they were. Basically, that's the universal answer. It compromised our resiliency factors. Anything else? Oh, there's one.
Thank you for your presentation today. Super interesting. I had a question on, you touched on, the role of the community or the church in terms of if you see someone in distress, like you don't have to take it on, but you have to get them to the right place. And can you talk more about what that means to you?
I'd be happy to. And you don't really have to wing it, by the way. There's training for lay people. It's called mental health first aid. Has anybody ever heard of that? Mental health first. Okay, so y'all heard of it. I love it. Actually, I borrowed a lot from that in relation to my co-occurring disorder class and it's a lot of information, but it shows us how to be approachable and how to approach people that we suspect are in distress. Now, if I see you, I'm not going to determine that you're in distress, but if I suspect it, I'm going to know how to approach you and sort of find out whether or not you're in distress. When we talk about approachability, one of the things is the state of Colorado loves spirituality, but they hate religion. I don't have a problem with that. Because religion gets in the way of healing from a spiritual perspective. Because we often have, I find at least in this church, that's why I affiliate it, you don't have a lot of norms and doctrines. You have history and insight. But I don't want to impose my beliefs on you. I just want to leave space for you to open up and become aware and insightful. You see, and there are certain skills that one can use. You all have heard of things like active listening. But the key is, how do I approach a person that I'm suspecting is in distress? The tone of my voice when I say, how are you? How are you doing? What's going on? My facial expression. If I see too much of it, I don't like the word concern, because that turns people off. I'm concerned about you. Leave that word alone. Take that out of your dictionary. I might say, I've noticed X, Y, and Z. Tell me about that. Tell me about it. Part of it also is knowing where to send them when they open up, you see. And this is where churches can play a major role, because one could have a resource base that would not do the intervention work, but know where to send the person or refer the person once we sort of realize that something is awry. Also, destigmatizing the whole thing. It's amazing how we fear people that are a bit erratic, outside of the norm. And I always tell people, maybe it's us. Maybe they see stuff we just haven't matured enough to be able to see. And in relation to the book that's coming out, it's called You're in Good Company. I started out with 28 heroes and heroines in the Bible. And I assessed them according to the DSM-5. That's the book that has all of our emotional and behavioral dysfunctions there with the symptoms. I got bipolar people in there. I got schizophrenic people in there. I have depressed people in there. All of that. So helping know that people, God's heroes and heroines, suffered from issues associated with mental health and wellness, and even issues associated with mental illness. you see. So I'm not sure whether that's answering the question, but if one is interested in sort of the training, easy enough to do. Mental health first aid. But depending on the approach, it could be anywhere from 4 to 7 hours, just allowing you to recognize symptoms, be comfortable with the symptoms, and know how to approach people within the context of what you've learned relative to recognizing the symptoms and helping them find help. And it's not always referring them to a professional. Sometimes it's just taking them out for a good meal or being an ear.
Thanks so much, Marjorie. We heard last week a little bit from Heartland Mental Health. Can you tell us a little bit about WellPower, which you're on the board of, correctly, in terms of where to refer people?
Yeah, WellPower Mental Health, it used to be Mental Health Center of Denver. Then I guess I'll say I like the MHCD, but I outvoted. Decided to change it to WellPower, mainly because of the stigma associated with mental health. WellPower is one of the top 3 community-based mental and behavioral health centers in the country. They provide a holistic approach to optimizing mental health and wellness. Everything from a place to sleep, to proper food. They have a farm. They have a fish farm. They have a dentist chair. They have all kinds of stuff going on at more than 32 locations in this city. To me, my biggest source of pride in serving as the chair of the governance committee for the board is the fact that they, just like this church, have internalized and made official an anti-Black racism policy. They're very sensitive to that. And so when we talk about WellPower, we're talking about a holistic approach with an intentional emphasis on the importance of cultural diversity, which you don't find in far too many, mental health and wellness interventions, you see. I see a lot of my students, they want to help, but they don't know how. And with WellPower, most of their clients are indigent, poor, don't have money, but we got some, and we can help them in a holistic way. So it's one of the top in the country, and it's holistic health, And happy to share even more. Should have brought some packets, but I didn't want to seem too self-centered.
Let's thank Dr. Lewis again, please. And Dr. Newton, thanks for the intro. That was wonderful.
I just want to say that Dr. Lewis is a member of Margie.
Oh, I thought you knew that. I mean, I know I haven't been around, but I've been traveling a little bit. But I'm kind of back a little bit, but I'll be around a little more.
Great. Thank you for coming today. Next Sunday, keep this in mind, Dr. Jenna Glover will be with us. Her specialty is youth and children with mental health issues, and it's really going to be important for us as a church to interact with Dr. Glover. It'd be really good. The last session on the 17th will be 3 Montview members sharing as a panel on living with mental health issues in families. Very honest, transparent, vulnerable, talking, sharing with you. Depression, really looking into the depths of depression. in a personal story and looking at suicide and how we deal with those issues. Okay, so lots of time during that session for questions. So thank you so much and hope to see you next week.